Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom, and in today's video, I'm joined by returning guest, Dr. Shaun Blanchard. Dr. Blanchard, welcome. How are you doing today?
Doing great, Dom. Yeah, great to be here. I've been in Australia now for 3 months, and I am moving into a house on Thursday. So I'm here
Awesome.
in my very the noble simplicity of my temporary accommodation.
Excellent. All right, well, this is our part 2 for our Pistoia's Liturgical Reform series. We did a part 1 a while back. I'll link that in the show notes, and this is the continuation of that conversation. But before we jump right in, let me introduce for any newcomers who Dr. Shaun Blanchard is. So Shaun Blanchard is lecturer in theology at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, on the Fremantle campus. I think that's how you pronounce it, in Western Australia. A North Carolina native and graduate of UNC, Oxford, Blackfriars Hall, and Marquette. Shaun writes on a variety of topics in early modern and modern Catholicism. He is the author of the Synod of Pistoia and Vatican II, Oxford University Press 2020, and with Ulrich Lehner, co-edited the Catholic Enlightenment, a Global Anthology, CUA 2021. With Stephen Bullivant, Shaun co-wrote Vatican II, A Very Short Introduction, Oxford University Press 2023. With Richard T. Yoder, Shaun co-edited Jansenism, an International Anthology, forthcoming with CUA 2024. In his free time, Shaun likes to watch college football and basketball and travel. He lives in Fremantle with his wife, Anne-Marie, and loves cats, fried chicken sandwiches, and English beer. Shaun's devotion to the University of North Carolina's football team has taught him more about eschatological hope than any of his theological studies. So once again, Shaun, welcome on the show.
Thanks. I normally don't get that past most editors, stuff about eschatological hope, and I submit that on everything I write, and I always wonder who's going to actually put it in print.
No, I thought it was great.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's dive right into our subject matter. So an opening question might be, what is the theological vision and reasoning behind the liturgical reforms of the Synod of Pistoia?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me just rehash a little bit on, it's just key dates and key people. I won't go into too much detail, but so in 1786, the Bishop of Pistoia Prato, which was a combined diocese very close to Florence, convened a diocesan synod. So September of 1786, his name was Scipione de' Ricci. He was in his 40s, kind of in the flowering of his career. And he was doing this under the auspices, under the authority of Peter Leopold, who was Grand Duke of Tuscany, a Habsburg, so the younger brother of the emperor, the Habsburg emperor in Vienna. And the context is this age of, so I have kind of 3 ingredients that make up what you could call Pistoianism or Pistoian reform. So the first, which I mentioned, is this kind of aggressive regalism. So it's kings and princes and states that are kind of asserting what is sometimes called Erastianism. That's state control of the church in financial matters, ecclesiastical matters, sometimes even liturgical matters. So Joseph II in Austria, Peter Leopold in Tuscany, and they have a kind of Gallican ecclesiology, and it's this sort of aggressive Catholic Enlightenment. So that's kind of the first ingredient here. The second is Jansenism. So Ricci was a very convinced Jansenist. He read the classic French sources. He was connected with a kind of Italian Jansenist movement, which really was from Turin all the way to Naples. And he had an international network, including the Church of Utrecht, who had been excommunicated for electing their own bishop and refusing the papally appointed bishop. And then the final ingredient, or sort of 3-pronged ingredients here, is Muratorian reform. So Ludovico Muratori is kind of the face of a moderate phase of Catholic Enlightenment. He dies in 1750, and he's closely connected with Pope Benedict XIV. So there's elements of this that would be shared by many, many thoughtful Catholics around Europe and around the world. And then there's elements that are much, much more controversial. So it's really those three things: Muratorian reform, Jansenism, and regalism, and quite aggressive regalism.
Gotcha.
So it's really a kind of a redo or a reboot of the Council of Trent. They look to Trent, they cite Trent, they defend Trent, but they're also trying to kind of redo a counter-Reformation Catholicism or a post-Reformation Catholicism in their own image. So they have decrees about almost every subject you can think of, and we're focusing today on the liturgy and devotional decrees. So there's a decree on prayer and a decree on the Eucharist. So theologically, I think the most important underpinnings are they believe that the Mass should be the center of all devotional life. So they kind of radically subordinate every other devotion to Mass. So Stations of the Cross, Rosary, all those things. We'll get into this more later. They don't have a problem with, they believe that the saints intercede. They believe that Mary, is this exalted Virgin Mother of God. They pray to Mary. They have no problem with that, but they do marginalize and subordinate any devotion outside of Mass or outside of what they see as kind of properly Christocentric. So that's probably the first thing. So Mass should be the center of devotional life, and your local parish should be the center of your religious life. So this leads them into conflict with the religious orders, conflict with nobles who have private oratories for their families, up in the hills and attending the local parish, things like that. The second thing is they believe that, and this is, of course, a thoroughly Orthodox Catholic position, that the laity also offer the sacrifice along with the priest. So they make the distinction between a ministerial priesthood, the ordained priesthood, and the common priesthood of believers, the baptismal priesthood. But they draw conclusions from this that many of their opponents think are radical or are tending towards Protestantism or all kinds of allegations. So the participation of the people in offering the sacrifice, and that theological principle leads them to a set of conclusions about participation in the liturgy, about the role of music in the liturgy, about all kinds of things. And probably the most radical conclusion is that they come very, very close. They stop just short of saying the Mass should be celebrated in the vernacular. And that is, for them, a deduction from a set of conclusions. Is a deduction from a set of principles. The set of principles is through the baptismal priesthood, the laity are called to participate in the one sacrifice of Christ. They can't participate if they don't understand. Ergo, what do? Well, we have missals printed in Italian, but that only works for some people. And then they kind of leave the conclusion hanging a little bit. Therefore, it would be better if Mass was in Italian. So, so that's that kind of we can really understand the whole panoply of changes and suggestions and censures on the basis of these principles and then the direction they go in with them.
I'm curious about you brought up the liturgical music. What do they say about that? I don't recall coming across that in that chapter.
Well, they have a kind of rigorous. I mean, at times they come across as quite killjoy because they'll say things like, well, the lyrics really, the lyrics need to be about the Mass. So it needs to be about what's going on in the Mass, or it needs to be about what the readings of the day are. They're combating a kind of, the problem is they're combating a lot of what Italians in that era really liked about Mass, which was, at times you had an incredible kind of operatic music, and they say, well, this is inappropriate for Mass. This is secular. So they rant about kind of secular songs. They also want the organ music to be silent from the offertory to the post-communion and excluding the preface. And the reason for that is because they want people to be praying and focusing, but they also want people to hear what's happening. So they don't want the priest praying sotto voce, and they want no music. So a lot of again, the theological principle of uniting your prayer with the prayer of the priest at the altar
Yeah.
And then they just say, well, what's the best way to do that? Well, if it's organ music blasting or
Yeah.
someone's belting out like it's an opera, then you're not focusing. Now, again, the problem is popular piety for centuries and centuries and centuries had done these things. So
Mhm.
people, loved hearing, I read
Yeah.
Owen Chadwick has this amazing book about 18th century Catholicism. And he says that there were reports of pastors in Italy frustrated that the people would leave mass after a particular singer was done with, I don't know, the Gloria or whatever. So this is
Yeah.
a overreaction to a very, very real problem, very
Well,
real sort of pastoral problem.
yeah, I do find it interesting. I don't want to do this too much, but I do find it interesting that they're perfectly in line with St. Pius X here and his musical reforms, especially through Solem, the rediscovery of Gregorian chant and the reintroduction of chant over, the kind of Baroque concert masses.
Yeah,
That yeah.
yeah.
So I do find that really interesting. Is that the liturgical movement definitely kind of starts to move in that direction as well. Okay, but bringing
Yes,
it back
yeah, to the
to
point. Well,
yeah,
just really quickly, it's interesting to trace from 1786 to 1958, 1965, whatever,
yeah,
and beyond.
hmm
A lot of these points get picked up
yeah,
from above or from below, and that is one of them. Let me
yeah,
just read. So, Article 5 of the Decree on the Eucharist, it says what I
hmm
quoted about silence from the
yeah,
offertory to the post communion, but then it says, regarding music and singing in the churches, the Synod considers, according to the mind of the fathers, and this is a methodological principle that we've talked about, that it's kind of Catholic
patristics. hmm
primitivism, something between primitivism and ressourcement.
Yeah.
These things were introduced to more greatly impress the sentiments of religion into the spirits of the faithful, meaning music, and to
hmm
enkindle the various affections of piety that are expressed by it. We reflect that in order to support this end, music should be simple, grave, modest, pious, adapted to the sense of the words. We therefore forbid any music that is devoid of such qualities. So this is the
Yeah.
typical way that they reason about artwork, music,
hmm
processions, everything.
Excellent. Just if I do this too much, Shaun, just stop me. But I just read
Well, no,
Ratzinger's.
you're supposed to stop me on tangents, so
Okay, well, I just
I'll
read
try.
Ratzinger's "The Spirit of the Liturgy," and with it's cited a lot by traditionalists, and I think rightfully so. I think it's a beautiful book. But if you read it in light of all the stuff we're talking about, this historical information, Ratzinger is actually very moderate. He's actually appealing to principles that you are bringing up right now, especially when it
Yeah,
comes to
definitely.
music. He speaks
Yeah.
of sobriety in music. He speaks of images, that if images are about the image itself, then they don't have that eschatological dimension which he associates with ad orientem. So a
Yeah.
lot of this is actually anyway, but because I think of
Well, if
Vatican II
if
as
you're steeped in the fathers like Ratzinger, then you're coming
yes,
across all this, and
exactly.
you're going
All
to
right,
develop
well,
the same principle.
yeah, excellent. Okay, so we talked about that patristic element being privileged, the scholastic kind of ignored or being under suspicion, and you mentioned the kind of radical Christocentrism, almost at the expense of private devotion. Um, if there's anything else you want to add, go ahead. But maybe we could delve into more of that aspect of private devotion versus the
Yeah.
parochial mass. Yeah,
Yeah. Let me, just one thing that kind of to continue the order that they go in, I
yeah,
think
let's
might
do
be
that. Yeah.
helpful. So on the patristic method, there
hmm
is a conduit. So I'm looking at this in tandem with Auctorum Fide, and Auctorum
Okay.
Fide is Pius VI bull of 1794, which condemns 85 propositions of the Synod of Pistoia. And like a lot of people, I first encountered the Synod of Pistoia through the bull Auctorum Fide. I was actually doing a project on religious liberty, John Courtney Murray, and I saw that
Oh, really?
Fenton, the CUA professor, Joseph Fenton,
Yeah.
cited Auctorum Fide against John Courtney Murray. And I knew about the syllabus of errors and I
Ah,
knew about all this stuff, but I didn't know what Auctorum Fide was. I
yeah.
just started at Marquette. So I started Googling around and thinking, I was like,
Yeah.
Jansenism in 1794. I thought Jansenism was, France and Pascal and all that. So that
Yeah.
led me on this massive journey. Um,
Yeah.
but so this is a kind of interesting methodological dispute between these radical reformers and the kind of more conservative, we could call it the official theology or the Vatican theology. So when they talk about the Eucharist, and this is the translation of the documents that you read. I translated part of the decree on the Eucharist and part of the decree on prayer, and this is coming out in 2024 in this Jansenist anthology that I co-edited with Rick Yoder. So just quoting them, they say, furthermore, I'll just give you some of their Eucharistic theology, how they think about it. They say, the Eucharist is a sacrifice. It's a true body and blood of Christ, all these things that we'd expect. They say, furthermore, we believe it is a truth belonging to the Catholic faith that when the substance of bread and wine cease after the consecration, there remains only appearances. The whole Christ is contained in this sacrament under each species, et cetera, et cetera. We condemn those who say otherwise. Then they say, and as for those things that belong to scholastic questions on the mode in which Jesus Christ is under the species, or on the nature of the species themselves, or similar things, it seems opportune to the Synod that the parish priests follow the style and teaching of the fathers. That is, to not be occupied by these questions, and not even to speak of them. May they consider and teach those mysteries with simplicity, endeavoring to animate and enkindle in the people a firm faith in the same mysteries by explaining the omnipotent love that God has for men. Now, so clearly what they're talking by scholastic questions, they're talking about transubstantiation. So Pius VI committee eventually prepares all these condemnations. They get promulgated by the Pope in 1794. And number 29 of Auctorum Fidei says the following. It says, the doctrine of the Synod, so this is condemning, the doctrine of the Synod, when it undertakes to explain the doctrine of faith in the rite of consecration, setting aside scholastic questions concerning the manner in which Christ is in the Eucharist, from which it exhorts pastors who exercise the duty of teaching to abstain, presents only these two propositions. That is, after the consecration, even the whole substance, etc. And then it says it entirely omits any mention of transubstantiation or conversion of the whole substance of bread into the body, the whole substance of wine into the blood, which the Council of Trent defined as an article of faith and which is contained in the solemn profession of faith. I don't think it's really fair to say they omit any question of conversion, but they don't mention transubstantiation very conspicuously. So then the condemnation says, inasmuch as this imprudent and suspicious omission, the knowledge of an article pertaining to the faith is removed, as well as an expression consecrated by the Church to safeguard her profession of faith against heresies, insofar as it is intended to lead to its oblivion, as if it were a matter of a merely scholastic question, is pernicious, derogatory to the exposition of the Catholic truth regarding the dogma of transubstantiation, and favorable to heretics. So this is this condemnation in my mind, because it's not saying the Pistoians are heretics in their understanding of the Eucharist, because they're clearly not. But it is saying basically your primitivism is the wrong method. So a term that begins in, when do they start? They start, I think the first uses of transubstantiation are in the 12th century. And then the actual term, it's consecrated, Aquinas is a major user of it. And then they're basically saying something can happen 1200 years after Christ. And through usage by popes and councils and theologians, it can become, what is the phrase? An expression consecrated by the Church to safeguard her profession of faith. Whereas the Pistoians would say that's fine if you're talking about the 3rd, 4th, 5th century. We can say, homoousios is that. But the age of the fathers is over, and scholasticism, they would say, is at best misses the unhelpful, right? So this is the primary theological methodological division. And then you can understand pretty much the whole the Pistoian side and the Roman side through this methodological difference.
I do want to add for the audience a link in the show notes on a video I did with Dr. Brett Salkeld on transubstantiation. He wrote a really helpful book on what transubstantiation actually is and how it's often misunderstood by Protestants and Catholics alike. And I thought that was very enlightening, because he goes through the history of the doctrine, what it was prior to the coining of that word, the scholastic categories, and then how modernity make substance into basically another accident, and all that's very relevant to what the Pistoians are doing, I think, and also to the church's response. But yeah, so I'll add that in the show notes, and I think that's very interesting.
Brett's really sharp. He's a really good. He's pedagogically really good. So what, and then what they don't condemn is it. So the Pistoians go on and they say, on the other hand, we command parish priests to employ the utmost care to remove from the minds of the faithful any base or material ideas concerning this mystery. They are to instruct them the body of Christ is not an animal body, corpo animale, but spiritual and life-giving. Christ is in the Eucharist, not in the manner of other natural bodies, but in a supernatural and spiritual manner. Now, you would think, on a certain understanding of transubstantiation, that they would go, oh, that's too Protestant. But no, the Vatican theologians were good theologians, and they would affirm that Christ is not present in the manner of a natural body, physically, but in a supernatural, spiritual manner. So the distinction between physical and bodily is not one that only 20th century Catholics are making. They understand this.
Yeah, I highlighted that part when I was reading through it. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, what would be a next theological point when it comes to liturgical reforms?
So they move from here into a discussion of sacrifice, of Eucharistic sacrifice, and they give a kind of basically patristic understanding of it. They cite St. Augustine. It's the true worship of God in spirit and truth. It is the one, we believe the sacrifice is one of a spiritual nature. They cite St. Augustine. So they use words like victim and immolate, but then they also understand this in this patristic manner. And then they move on to say, this is where we were getting into the stuff about music, but the discussion of music follows from the principle of, in Article 5 of the Decree on the Eucharist, they say the Synod desires priests observe with diligence all the prescribed ceremonies and rites, and that they pronounce the words distinctly and devoutly. May they not accelerate the action or excessively delay it in a manner inconvenient to those assisting. Now, again, but they're envisioning the people hearing them. So it's good. I'm sure they would say, if you're celebrating privately, yes, it's good to distinctly and devoutly pronounce, but it's always at service of what they see as the communal nature of the Mass. The priest is clearly leading. The priest is in the ministerial priesthood that is not shared by the faithful, and yet the action is joint. So everything they do is ordered to that. They have prescriptions like only one altar in each church, things that really make people mad, with what they call ornamento, so the decoration of the church, no relics and flowers on top of the altar, which is a great way to make people mad, especially the women of the parish who've been preparing the flowers for generations and generations. So they have all these sort of good, this view of what noble simplicity, Christocentrism, the focus of the Mass, but then the way that they clear away what they see as the dross is exceedingly offensive to the average Catholic.
Just drastic,
of 1786. So rather than saying, make sure the flowers aren't out of control or blocking the view, or make sure we take great care to preserve our relics or whatever, rather than those types of things, they kind of go scorched earth, remove any image that is not biblical and clearly ordered to worship and things like that. It's also kind of this context of the Counter-Reformation. You have this kind of Renaissance humanistic celebration of the human body and things that are like quasi-pagan and tons of nudity and all this stuff. And then you have the more somber, even severe Counter-Reformation instinct, which says this is lasciviousness and this is sensuality. And they're really, really far on that end of the spectrum. So definitely not the humanist Renaissance celebration of, bare-breasted women and incredibly muscular men and all that. They want that completely out of religious spaces.
It's just fascinating to me listening to you talk, how much this lines up exactly with the Spirit of the Liturgy, the book by Ratzinger. He says everything you're saying right now. It's pretty incredible. I'll link to that book down below as well on Amazon for people to get. So I find it interesting that their ecclesiology is really, it's Eucharistic, right? And in a sense where it's kind of trying to move beyond a more legalistic ecclesiology that you had in the High Middle Ages, where the church is this kind of institution, as opposed to the church being the Eucharist, really the Eucharist making the church. And I mean, you definitely see that in the 20th century come back to the center, and how that makes the mass, the parochial mass, the center of the local church. So I find that really fascinating to see those connections.
They have like, in theory, a lot of what they say about all that is beautiful and solid and biblical and patristic. The problem is that there's a power struggle going on between, for lack of a better word, ultramontane Catholicism, because I would include in there the religious orders. It's not just the papacy, the mendicant orders. Jesuits, and there's a kind of secular religious split, meaning diocesan versus orders.
Yeah.
And then Pope and sovereign. So they have this beautiful, beautiful theology, but the context in which they're siding with the Grand Duke of Tuscany over the Pope. And there are probably certain circumstances, the Pope was a temporal sovereign at the time. So there are circumstances where that's appropriate. I mean, where you say, no, the Pope's claim to this, place is fraudulent or wrong, and I'm siding with the emperor or whatever. That's completely fine. Dante did that. But they're siding, they're basically saying, on the authority of the prince and the local bishop, and they would use whichever argument worked in the given circumstance. We're going to do X, we're going to do X, Y, Z against the Pope or ignoring the Pope. And that meant that all these beautiful things in their theology couldn't be heard, as the kids would say now. So it's kind of tragic, because, like you say, a lot of this stuff is solid and beautiful, and it comes back in the 20th century, and things that we could associate with Ratzinger or Pius X, much less,
or Pius XII,
but in the context in which they're doing it, it's kind of explosively provocative to the common people, and also to Rome.
Okay. Let's see.
So I could talk about a couple of the kind of the ornamento. They talk about the decoration stuff. So they say
definitely
only one altar in each church, and then Auctorum Fide condemns that by saying the proposition that says it is fitting in accordance with the order of divine services and ancient custom. So there's two arguments. This is the custom of the early church, and the logic of the liturgy is that it's the communal act of the parish, right? So they have those two arguments. And then the condemnation goes on that there be only one altar in each church, and therefore it is pleased to restore that custom. So they're not just saying this is the ideal. Rome might let that pass if you say that, but they actually order it. They say this is now what we're doing in the Diocese of Pistoia. So Rome says this is rash, injurious to the very ancient pious custom, flourishing and approved for these many centuries in the church, especially in the Latin church. So they have a historical awareness as well. They know that this is not the same in the East. Okay. But they're defending, they're saying this is, they kind of one up them. They say, instead of an ancient custom, a very ancient pious custom, which is approved for these many centuries. And one of the key figures they cite is Gregory the Great in their discussion. So now Gregory the Great is probably right on the cusp of what is, the Pistoians would see the beginning of a decline, right? The great flowering is, of course, St. Augustine and his disciples, Fulgentius, and people like this. And then right at the about 600 AD, I think, is where they would start seeing decline. And Gregory the Great is right there. So they're both acquiring, because of the way that historical research is trending, they're both acquiring a deeper and deeper historical awareness. And this is a process that really begins in humanism in the 15th century. And it's certainly present in the battle against Protestantism in the 16th century. And by now you have generations of, I wouldn't say it's not historical consciousness in the modern sense of, kind of new from
Mhm.
Newman to present, but it's definitely a
Yeah.
historical awareness. Things in the past are not the same as they are now, and we have
Yeah.
to justify why that is. Both
Yeah.
sides are doing that.
And Pistoia seems to be saying, therefore, we have this kind of corruption scheme. We got to go back to primitivism. And then Rome
Yes,
is trying to say, okay, let's slow down. Like, we can't
right.
say that, the church kind of became not the church. We got to find a continuity.
Definitely.
And yeah, okay.
And Rome is beginning. You have very, very early understandings of development of doctrine.
Hmm.
Very, very, very elementary. Like someone defending, like there was a Scotist whose name escapes me, who's defending the Immaculate Conception, and he
Hmm.
starts getting in the 18th century, and he starts getting towards what we would call development of doctrine.
Yeah.
The kind of ultramontane position doesn't yet have that, but it kind of knows it needs it. And
Yeah.
this is the sort of challenge that actually sparks really serious thinking about development of doctrine, because
I see.
it's manifest that what the church is doing in the 18th century and what the church was doing even in the 5th century or 4th century
Yeah. It has
is
differences. Yeah.
exactly, and they want
Yeah.
to justify the growth. So they want
Yeah.
to say we could maybe proclaim Mary as immaculately conceived, and we need a kind of logic of how we could do that. Whereas the
Yeah.
Pistoians would say, "Hey, you can believe that. That's
Yeah.
a beautiful, pious belief, but you cannot define that because
Yeah.
it's absent from the
Yeah.
testimony of the early church." Um,
Fascinating. Yeah.
so they move on to they say it's rash and injurious to the pious custom of the church to say this stuff about relics and flowers. And then I think the kind of culmination of Rome's response to this is Auctorum Fide, Article 33. So I'll read that one. It
Okay.
quotes the most important statement of the synod. So number 33 says, the proposition which shows itself eager to remove the causes through which, in part, there has been induced a forgetfulness of the principles relating to the order of the liturgy. So the allegation is not the Roman rite as it's celebrated is heretical or wrong or in
Hmm.
error, but that it is forgetful of principles that are actually in it. And
Hmm.
this is I think Muratori articulates this in a much less offensive way than the Pistoians
Yeah.
do. So quoting from the Synod, by recalling the liturgy to a greater simplicity of rites, by expressing it in the vernacular language, and by uttering it in a loud voice. So
Hmm.
simplicity, vernacular, and no sotto voce,
No sort of which. Yeah.
out loud. And then this is the Roman response. As if the present order of the liturgy, received and approved by the church, had emanated in some part from the forgetfulness of the principles by which it should be regulated, is rash, offensive to pious ears, insulting to the church, and favorable to the charges of heretics against her. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's the kind of, so it's not heretical. They don't even say it's erroneous. They just say it's
Yeah.
rash. So it's hasty. It's
Hmm.
too much too soon. It's
Yeah.
offensive. It insults the church. And I think this is the kicker, favorable to the charges of heretics. And they're clearly talking
Yeah.
about Protestants there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I find it fascinating because, first of all, Auctorium Fidei, when it goes through all of those condemnations that is several of which you're bringing up, it's very careful. You can tell there's some very
Yeah.
intelligent theologians behind that document. It's very careful to say the right thing for the right proposition, and I find that really fascinating. But also, like if the audience knows about Henri de Lubac's book Catholicism, he has a passage in it as kind of a classic of the ressourcement guys. Catholicism is the title, and in it he talks about theology being Catholic, not just counter-reformational. And
Mm.
I think that, especially if you read that book with the Second Vatican Council in mind, it becomes clear that the shift from condemnation and anathemas to a positive exposition that's grounded in the sources. I mean, it's all there in that book, Catholicism by de Lubac, and it's that shift that you're bringing up of this the shift of mentality that opens up to ecumenism and to the possibility of church unity with people that might be able to be brought in through a more favorable liturgy and things like that. And of course, people don't like that called the Reforms Protestant, everything that we're talking about. So
Absolutely. No, that's
yeah.
and the let me say something about the committee. So when
Hmm.
I wrote my doctoral dissertation is on the Synod of Pistoia, so I was able to go to what used to be called the Vatican Secret Archives.
Nice.
They renamed it. I can't remember. It's like Apostolic Archives or something. But so I looked at the committee, and I didn't have enough time to go through. I mean, it's vast, the documentation they have, because they met 3 major blocks of committee meetings between 1788 and 1792 or 93. But the key, you're right that they're very careful. The key, so the most important figure is Cardinal Gerdil. He was a Barnabite from northern Italy, I think from Savoy, and he wanted to make they often will condemn. They'll use the Latin terms "sic intellecta," thus understood. So then they'll say what the heretical understanding is. So early on, they condemned the Pistoian statement that the Pope is the ministerial head of the Church. Now, on one hand, that's like obviously true, but they say if you mean by that, and they censor an understanding of limited jurisdiction and stuff like that. So sic intellecta or quietinus inuit, insofar as it intimates,
as it means,
So if you're implying that we must do it this way, or that you have the right to unilaterally decree this, then we condemn it as, rash and detracting of the authority of the Holy See and stuff like that. So Gerdil was very conservative. He was very much a defender of the ultramontane system, but he was incredibly learned, and he was pastorally sensitive to, I don't want to condemn Muratori's descendants up who are trying to, have vernacular missals to the laity, or things that we do approve of, at least in a limited. That was dicey, but Gerdil was not a sort of scorched earth, all of this is bad. And that's really good, because this document could have been much less nuanced. And there's also a progression of the way the Jansenist condemnations work. So the condemnation of Jansen, which is infamous because the actual words are not in the book. As far as the actual statements that they condemn, the theses are not in the Augustinus verbatim. Now you can make a good argument that, well, that's really what he means, but they're not in there. Then they decide, when they condemn Canel and Unigenitus in 1713, the committee says, well, we're going to condemn verbatim so that no one can say this isn't in Canel. So they condemn 101 lines that are literally verbatim taken from Canel, but they condemn them in globo. So the actual condemnation's at the very end, and it's just a list of every censure, from heretical to rash or offensive to pious ears. So then you fast forward to Auctorum Fidei, and Gerdil says, look, basically they're implicitly going, we kind of didn't do it right then, we didn't do it right then, now we're going to get it right. We're going to condemn verbatim propositions, we're going to attach censures, and we're going to explain to the degree that the censure would or wouldn't apply. Okay. So that, I think, is we're getting towards the kind of, ironically, given the way people think now, we're getting greater clarity of what Rome is actually has a problem with.
And I find it beautiful
that's interesting too.
I just find it beautiful how, leading up to Vatican I, that basically officially sanctions the ultramontane ecclesiology. Then, as you've brought up before, you have this possibility of a reform that is not hasty, although its effects, you might, argue, were kind of chaotic after the council, as people know. Definitely, but you have this possibility, this overture, for this fruitful reform, really. And John the 23rd, but and who actually called back to what's his name, the Trent theologian, Borromeo, St. Charles Borromeo, exactly. And a lot of this is about the proper implementation of Trent. And so anyway, I just find all those connections fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a saner, I mean, when you take the whole regalist paradigm out of it, it just tremendously, I mean, it completely changes the situation. It allows for papal, you don't have Vatican I without that fading away, I think. But also, I think it allows for reformers they have to be in direct dialogue with Rome in a way that you could be quite unilateral if the King of France says, well, I'm the protector of, my authority comes from God too, directly, and I was anointed at, where did they anoint him? Chaim? in the
Reims, yeah.
Cathedral of Reims. Yeah.
Yeah.
And his authority, he's an almost quasi-apostolic figure in the Ancien
Yeah.
regime.
Mm-hmm.
So
Uh-huh.
that creates a kind of competing head of the church in to some extent, at least regarding
Yeah.
jurisdiction. And
Mm-hmm.
then that's completely gone in the 19th and 20th centuries, and that's a good thing. It
Yeah.
led to an inflation of papal authority that was probably extreme, but I think for
Yeah.
the libertas ecclesia, the freedom of the church to be the church,
Yeah.
it's certainly a good thing for global Catholicism. Imagine
Yeah.
if we had, I mean, China's a problem in this way, but imagine if we had, if the U.S. Senate was blocking certain cardinals from attending the Synod in
Yeah.
Rome or something. I mean, this is what would have
Yeah.
happened
No.
in the 18th century.
Okay, but so returning to the liturgical reforms themselves, unless there's one you want to do next, one that came to mind is this bibliocentrism in the liturgy.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, unless there's anyone else, any other one you
No,
want to bring up first.
that's really important. I mean, I think the centrality of the Christocentric view of devotions, and then the view of Scripture are the next two things to talk about for sure. So regarding the Bible, they say, let me read the condemnation, because the condemnation I think sheds light on the tension here. I mean, so the Pistoians are basically saying only true inability to read Scripture excuses one from reading Scripture. Okay, so only illiteracy or mental incapacity or extreme poverty where you can't acquire books or something. And books were, to be fair, expensive then. Otherwise, the Mass and the Bible should be the center of your religious life. So everything else devotionally, you want to pray the rosary, fine. You have devotions to certain saints, great. You kneel in front of your favorite painting in the church and you pray litanies, that's all fine. But if that is in competition to or dislodges personal Bible reading, or some kind of catechetical Bible reading, some sort of setting, because they do have the same Catholic understanding of the footnote should be from the church fathers. You shouldn't have an interpretation that departs from the official teaching of the church, blah, blah, blah. So, but otherwise, Scripture is the center. So here's the condemnation, Auctorum Fidei 67. It says, the doctrine that asserts that only a true incapacity can dispense from the reading of sacred Scripture, and that adds that the obfuscation of the first truths of religion that has developed because of the negligence of this precept continues to spread, is false, rash, disturbing to the peace of souls, and condemned on another occasion in Canel. So that's a reference to Unigenitus. Okay, so they're saying true incapacity can dispense is condemned. So meaning only true incapacity. So they're saying someone could just decide that they don't want to read the Bible, and they could have the money to afford it or the access to it, and they could be literate, and you can't censure them for not reading the Bible. And then they also condemn what is an ecclesiological principle. The obfuscation of the first truths of religion is because people aren't reading the Bible. And this goes back to the origins of Jansenism. So all the stuff about predestination and grace, so Molinism versus Augustinianism, and all the stuff about rigorism in the confessional versus alleged laxism in the confessional. So this censure was an original critique of the Jansenists that are saying if people were reading the Bible, they would read St. Paul and the Gospels, and they would know that grace is radically gratuitous, and their position on grace. And then they would say the same thing about morals. They would say there's no excuse for the casuistry that the Jesuits are doing. So it's seen as part of a whole by the Pistoians. No, go ahead.
Well, this is super important to me. That context, I mean, that makes an interpretation of that passage of Denzinger night and day. And this is something that comes up a lot when I speak with other friends or other people, and, and they do have a Denzinger or something, and they'll quote Denzinger 456 or something, and it's like, if you don't know the context, that could change radically the meaning of that censure. And what you just described, I think, is the perfect example, because what is meant by the censure you read implies all of this theological baggage on how to read St. Paul on grace. I mean, that's huge
definitely.
To me. So,
for sure.
Just wanted to add that.
No, that's why you like Denzinger theology is,
Yeah.
I mean, I love Denzinger. I borrowed this
Yeah.
from my good friend Tom Gourlay. I don't know if you know Tom Gourlay. He's
I don't.
he let me
I just
borrow
bought
this
one of
because
those. Yeah.
oh, good. Yeah,
I've been
my
using it
wife
for
bought it
class.
for
Yeah.
me. My wife bought
Yeah.
it for me for my birthday one day, and her
Yeah.
friends thought it was just hilarious that that's what her husband wanted for his birthday. It's expensive, you know.
Yeah.
But my good friend at Notre Dame, Australia, Tom Gourlay, is the chaplain, and he's a real kind of communio guy. Nice. Yeah, it's great. It's such a good edition. The footnotes are fantastic. I mean, it's like what this doctoral dissertation at Leuven was censured in 1568, and then it made its way into this condemnation. But Tom Gourlay's a great guy, and just finished his doctoral dissertation on Giussani, who's a communion and liberation guy. And he very kindly let me borrow this because my books are still in a shipping crate. They'll be delivered on Thursday. But anyway, yeah. So the connection. So there again, there's a couple of things going on here. So they say that it's false, meaning not only true incapacity can dispense, they would say. So there could be other reasons why someone doesn't want to read the Bible. Now, I think our perspective today would be if you're capable of reading Scripture and you're not reading Scripture, there's some problem. There's some sort of, at the very least, it's not ideal, right? So I think there's been a real development there.
For the better,
for the better. But then the condemned on another occasion in Canel is what they're saying is Pistoia, the Vatican, I should say, is saying Pistoia is reviving what we tried to condemn in Uni Genitus and still won't go away. So they see it as like they're cutting off all these Hydra heads, and there's just more and more and more, and they're really frustrated. And I read their debate about this. The cardinals and the theologians on the committee, and they're furious whenever Canel is quoted verbatim in the Acts of Pistoia, which is fairly frequent. You can just tell that they would have like this spasm across their face. So anything touching, and this says something about the psychology of the church at the time, anything touching previous Jansenist condemnations is incredibly neuralgic because it strikes directly at a set of pastoral problems and the authority of Rome. Anything touching Protestantism directly, or rather, I should say indirectly, is also incredibly neuralgic. So like I was just reading over right before we got on, I was glancing over the second to last chapter of my book where I go into the committee deliberation, and they'll say things like, Calvino se stesso sembrano, I'm going to forget the Italian, but Calvin himself seemed orthodox at times. So like, because like one cardinal is like, well, they're not wrong about the Eucharist. It's not an animal body. It is spiritual and life-giving. They omit transubstantiation, but they don't deny transubstantiation. And this guy, I think it was Vitaliano Borromeo, he blurts out, Calvino se stesso sembrano ortodosso. So it's like they have this whole thing about like, we condemn this in Jan Hus, we condemn this in Bias, we condemn this in Calvin, and now it's coming back. And they, whenever that's the case, they insist on a condemnation. If it's something that they see as ambiguous but new, then they maybe say, okay, we'll see where they're going with this. But if they see it as a line of condemnations, then they always condemn. Although there's a funny moment. They decided initially they were not going to single out the Gallican articles for condemnation because that was very touchy. And it was they weren't really condemned as much as they were rescinded by Louis XIV when he got what he wanted, even though it was mandated that they be taught in French universities. But anyway, they were saying, well, do we condemn this? Do we not? And remember, the French Revolution had just broken out. And one of the cardinals said, we should say nothing about it lest we give a pretense for some French fanatic to write numerous pamphlets. So I just thought, so that was funny that all these Italians sitting around in Rome, just imagining a French fanatic just writing pamphlet after pamphlet against the bloated authority of Rome. So anyway, but regarding the sacred scripture, so this is a time of kind of cautious. There's more openness to lay vernacular Bible reading now in contexts where previously there hadn't been. So there was a Portuguese translation of the Bible by an Oratorian named Pereira, who was
Mm-hmm.
at least a philo-Jansenist, if not a full Jansenist. But in Italy, the first approved post-Trent vernacular translation is by an opponent of the Synod of Pistoia. It's by Archbishop Martini of Florence, who
Oh
fell
yeah.
out very, very sharply with Scipione de' Ricci. They had enough in common to really, really despise each other, if you know what I mean, because Ricci
Mm-hmm.
saw him as kind of a sellout. Ricci said, "You
Mm.
know the truths of religion. You know what we should do, and you're too you're cowtailing to
To
what
Rome.
the
Yeah.
world, to Rome and to the popular piety of the people." Whereas Martini, I think Martini was a principled man, and I think he just disagreed with Ricci. But
Yeah.
Martini translated the entire Bible into Italian, and it was approved by Pope Pius VI. So Pope Pius VI's commendatory letter is actually that if you have an old Italian Bible, it's kind of like having a Douay Rhymes, on
Yeah.
your
Mm-hmm.
mantelpiece here. If you have it, they often print the letter from Pius VI saying these are
Yeah.
springs of healthy water gushing up in the
Yeah.
soul, stuff like that. So they're
Yeah.
not uniformly against Bible reading, but they are against the view that they're against. What they don't want to happen is a Jansenist pastor or a whatever reformer pastor to say to lay people, here's your Bible. If you're literate, you must read it.
Yeah.
Because they had a different perspective at the time, but also they just thought it's too confusing to normal people, and
Yeah.
all the things that we now look back on and we kind of wince.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I mean, they said,
Yeah.
most people can understand it. They get it sufficiently through catechesis,
Yeah.
and
To
on
be
and on.
fair, I mean, if you look at Protestantism today, there's something to that. I mean, I don't want.
I mean, no, the concept that an individual needs to kind of construct their
His
doctrine
own
through personal Bible reading is totally crazy. I agree with that. It's just I don't think the Jansenists meant that. I think they meant something like what we mean today. It's just the theological conclusions that they thought resulted from Bible reading are not what we in many instances would hold. So this is another really nuanced debate at the time, because there are very few people that are saying no Bible reading is appropriate, and then no one is saying give everyone a Bible and just tell them good luck. There's everyone's something in between those two things.
And what about so you talked about Marian devotion, and maybe can we talk a little bit more how they saw that really as taking away from Christocentrism? This is hyper focus on the saints. I mean, I guess we kind of covered that with the non-Eucharistic devotions.
So they have like a polemic against new devotions. So the Sacred Heart for them is out because it's new. It's 17th century. It's also associated with the Jesuits. They talk about the mystery of the Passion of Jesus Christ, and they basically throw shade, as the kids would say, on. I'm sorry, I must sound incredibly old when I say things like this, but I was trying to think of a pithy phrase. But they say the spirit of compunction and fervor can certainly not be tied to a determined number of stations or to arbitrary reflections, which are often false, more often fickle, and always full of stumbling blocks. So this is clearly a shot at the Franciscans and the Stations of the Cross. Now, this to me is just like shooting yourself in the foot, because what you could say is we're going to instruct priests on how best to guide their people through the Stations of the Cross, and instead they attack people and they needlessly piss people off, which is what Jansenists were really good at doing. Okay, now regarding Mary, so they say,
Shaun, can I interrupt just before we get into Mary real quick? Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
About the Sacred Heart, I read this little book called Behold the Pierced One by Ratzinger, and he brings up the work of Hugo Rahner, who's Karl Rahner's brother. He talks about the how the devotion got kind of cut off, like you were talking about, from the more ecclesial form of Eucharistic devotion, and it become very affective and not very rational, you might say. But he shows how Hugo Rahner connects this understanding of the heart in a way that brings it back into the more bibliocentric and ecclesiocentric. Just same thing with that Vatican II did with Mary, by the way. He shows how that happened. So I strongly recommend this to the audience, where it's a beautiful example of exactly this dynamic that we're talking about, of things getting offhand, needing reform, and then the kind of radical idea of just getting rid of it versus how to bring it back in. So just want to point that out. But
Absolutely.
about Mary,
No, that's a really cool connection, because now we have Ratzinger doing this, and also Karl Rahner's brother doing this, and Guardini does a lot of this kind of stuff too. The liturgical movement in many ways is picking up the exact same points. They're getting them mostly from the church fathers, from the Bible, and they're thankfully not as off the rails on some of this as the Pistoians were. So they get into a devotion of get into a discussion of true and solid devotion to Jesus Christ, the necessity of his mediation. And they say explicitly, we do not intend to exclude the invocation of the saints. And they talk about the role of the saints as members of the church. There is a holy exchange between the people on earth and the people in heaven, a commercio. And the end of that is the glory of God and the salvation of the elect. They then move into a discussion of Mary. They say, we confess with the Holy Council of Trent that invoking Mary is good and useful, and they commend special devotion to Mary. She was chosen by God to be the mother of Jesus, et cetera, et cetera. They cite St. Augustine. And then they say this special cult of the Blessed Virgin. And just if for the audience, cult in this context is devotion towards a particular thing. It's nothing to do with the way creepy. In English we now say cult. Cultus is veneration or worship in Latin. So the special cult of the Blessed Virgin, however, just like that which is rendered to other saints, must be regulated according to the spirit of the church, which knows how to place the appropriate distance between creatures and God, who is the only source of life and salvation. So the things that they take aim at, they say external practices of devotion to the Blessed Virgin and the other saints. We wish to remove every shadow of superstition. That includes attaching a definite efficacy to a determined number of prayers and salutations. For the most part, either the sense of the prayers is not perceived or the meaning is not understood, as is generally the case in other acts or objects that are external and material. So there's, again, this kind of duality between external, material, sensual, and internal, spiritual, pious, okay? That is maybe too sharp of a distinction. It will therefore be the duty of parish priests, and again, parish priests are the target of these documents. It's how should parish priests run parishes. Parish priests should exercise vigilance over the particular devotions of their people, too often inclined to superstition and materiality. And you wonder why the people react so negatively, because when they're mentioned, it's usually given that they're ignorant and superstitious. Now, they say beautiful things about them in theory. Like, oh, they are baptized.
Not to them.
But, this is a classic trap of the reformer. I just wrote an article on Yves Congar, the true and false reform, for this volume called Reforming the Church, which was published in view of the Synod. And it's a classic fault of the reformer, is loving the people in theory, but despising the people around. And politicians do this too. They love their country, but they despise the voter or the.
Can I just say that's exactly, I think, and we can open this up, but I think that's what happened after the council, is that the people got sidelined. And I know I keep bringing him up. Sorry if people get annoyed at me, but Ratzinger is actually a perfect example of someone who doesn't do that and who tries to tell the other reformers, don't forget about the people. Don't forget about the simple of faith. And the place of the simple in his heart is really important, especially because of his own sister who lived with him for a long time, who was one of those simples of faith. So
nun.
that to me, she was a nun. But I don't think she wore a habit, but she was a nun.
Okay.
But she lived with him. She cared for him up until he was Pope. She passed, I think, right before he became Pope, if I'm not mistaken. But
this was
anyway,
one of Ratzinger. Well, no, I love when you bring up Ratzinger, and I'm constantly citing Newman, Ratzinger, and Congar in my classes. I need to find new people to cite, but they just taken together, they just have so much to say about all these issues.
Absolutely.
But it's we see this after the council too, where it's like, so a document like Dominus Jesus, Ratzinger's defense of it was saying, like, okay, you can make all these theological distinctions about the goodness in other religions and the role of how God might use goodness and truth in, say, Buddhism as part of someone being saved. But what it looks like to normal people is all religions are, Jesus is this sort of privileged figure, but really pretty much every culture has this. And that was a misunderstanding that I think was a pastoral problem. And I don't blame Jacques Dupuy for that. I don't blame random theology professor for that. But it is the little ones is what Ratzinger would always cite on that. So basically, you have a concern, and again, this is tragic because the Pistoians have a really important point, and they are concerned for the lay people, but the way they do it comes across as unilateral and contemptuous. The Vatican theologians have a real concern for the little ones, and they don't want to disturb the piety of normal people, but they probably aren't. They probably aren't doing enough. Like in the sense that there's some sort of happy medium. I mean, I'd like to think Muratori is the happy median, but unfortunately, that had just that spirit had been marginalized.
I was gonna say maybe we could do. I know you're busy, but maybe down the line a video just on Muratori because he fascinates me. I want to learn more about him.
We definitely could. My students. So I just taught this material last week, and I have a really amazing class of guys from seminarians from Colombia, Peru, Brazil. Got female lay students from Australia. I got a Norbertine from Southeast Asia, ordinariate student from Indonesia. I mean, I've got, it's such a diverse class, and I gave them background, ecclesial, like neo-catechumenal way, diocese, Norbertines, super cool. But I gave them Muratori and the Synod of Pistoia. And Pistoia is very technical, it led to some interesting conversations that they really grasped on Muratori, because Muratori is a kind of narrative in Della Regolata, regulated devotion. So I translated that with help from an Italian friend, Glauco Scattini, and that's in the volume with Lehner, the Catholic Enlightenment volume. But that 16-page or 14-page excerpt from Muratori could be a good basis for discussion, because I think he gets I think he gets this median correct, and I think it was a sign of the times that in the 1770s, 80s, 90s, that moderate perspective was not gone, but marginalized. And part of it is like the suppression of the Jesuits is just like a lightning rod of polarization, because there were a lot of people who were on board with some Jansenist critiques, but after the suppression of the Jesuits, they were like, whoa, this is a serious injustice, and it's a major attack on the church, and its sovereigns are encroaching on the church. And so someone like Martini, Archbishop of Florence, he really pulled back from his reformist inclination, because he saw where it was headed with this, particularly with Ricci and the Synod of Pistoia. So anyway, but back to the devotion. So they essentially what they say about Mary is they're critiquing the way certain devotions are understood. So attaching a definite efficacy to a determined number of prayers. They talk about images and say sacred images should be honored and venerated, but one should not believe there is any divinity or special power in these things. And the word they use for power in Latin is virtu, like related to virtue, but it means an innate power. This would lead to honoring them in a special way, fixing our confidence in them, in imitation of pagans who place their trust in idols. When we honor images, we must intend to refer this honor to the original of them, that is, to adore Jesus Christ in himself and in his saints. So for the Pistoians, anything where if you have to be explicitly understanding veneration of, or rather worship is Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ in the saints. So you're honoring God for the example of Saint whoever or Mary, but not Mary or the saint directly. And that is a tricky sell in the 18th century, because it looks like you're saying people shouldn't be devoted to Mary as such, and that did not go over well.
Absolutely. I'm going to add one more thing in the show notes. I'm going to have to listen to this again. I'm going to add this article I wrote on. It's called The Mariology of Lumen Gentium, where we get a little bit into what the council did on that. And
I think the Pistoians would really like Lumen Gentium on this. although they wouldn't. That I don't think they liked terms. They understood Marian mediation, but they wouldn't want to see the word mediatrix. I don't think.
Yeah.
Because they would say
Doesn't
that's
sound like something they'd like. Yeah.
confusing or ambiguous, but the concept of Marian mediation they accept.
Gotcha.
They're really attacking the devotional apparatus. They're
Yeah.
not really attacking the theology as such.
Yeah. Makes sense. Before keep going on whatever you want to cover, but I just want to make sure we fit in the reception of communion, if there's anything about that. Okay, but go ahead.
Well, just finishing up with images. So they have a list of things that they want to essentially ban. They say anything which presents false dogmas as those of the carnal heart of Jesus. So they accuse the Sacred Heart of being Nestorian. Well, I think we've talked about this before. Anything that shows an image of what they call the incomprehensible Trinity, and they're censured for this because the Church approved some images of the Trinity and not others. So they did, like that. What's the beautiful painting by the Russian painter? The three angels visiting Abraham. I can't remember the name of the painter, but there were representations. I don't mean that image in particular. I just mean that kind of image they would approve. But a man with three heads, they did not approve. So those were out there. So the Pistoians again, they're reacting to a real problem, but they're going to scorched earth on it in a way where Rome goes, whoa. There actually are artistic ways of representing the Trinity that are okay, and it's a power struggle. Rome is saying actually we have the right to determine this, not the Diocese of Pistoia. So there's always the ecclesiology underneath this, and then they just make the kinds of the normal kinds of things that you would expect with devotional abuses, and they can say very offensive things when they say rendering special devotion to a given image and resorting to it more than others, as if God and the saints listen in a special way to the prayers that are made before it, or that God has attached the promise of granting his graces to the veneration of it, they condemn. Then they say, to this same end, the Holy Synod wishes that the pernicious custom of making distinctions between certain images be completely removed. This is especially so in the case of the Virgin, who is distinguished by particular names and titles that are, for the most part, vain and puerile. So this, and then I have a footnote here. This is ultimately their undoing when it comes to the diocese. So I wrote, this prescription sought to roll back the long and venerable devotional custom of having special titles attached to images of saints, especially Mary. This austerity proved exceedingly offensive to many people of the diocese. One cause of the riots that helped to hasten Ricci's downfall was the belief that the beloved Madonna dell'Umiltà, Our Lady of Humility, was under threat. So this was this beautiful altarpiece image in I believe it's a basilica, the Basilica of the Madonna dell'Umiltà, and Ricci was threatening to remove it, allegedly, and people rioted. Okay, so now, did some people have a superstitious understanding of the image? I'm sure they did, but again, the way they're going about this is no, just educate people more. This is a beautiful image. This is a part of our heritage as people of Pistoia. This image is not better, or this title is not more efficacious than Our Lady of Grace or whatever, Our Lady of the Rosary or whatever it might be. So there's a way they could have done this. And instead they antagonize the people. So that's essentially the whole deal with devotions and images, and there are clear parallels with the reception of Vatican II.
Absolutely. And I think, as you pointed out, you definitely kind of see this separation between the heart and the mind, between the spiritual, inner spiritual, and the outer, material practices and ritual. You definitely see that in the Pistoians, I think. But yeah.
No question. It's an Augustinianism that maybe, I have to be careful here because my philosopher friends will always correct me. But I mean, some of the early Jansenists like Antoine Arnaud were Cartesian. Not all of them were, but some of them were. And you definitely see an excessive binary
dualism
of body and spirit. Maybe you could call it extreme Augustinianism is better than Cartesianism.
That makes sense.
But this kind of thing was very offensive. So should we close with reception of communion?
If we can, that's the last thing I have on my list. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I could talk about this all day, but nobody would listen to it if I go on for too long.
I would. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I mean, I wish I could do a doctoral. There will never be a doctoral seminar on the Synod of Pistoia. So at best, I'll get 1
Yeah.
week. I'll do early modern Catholicism. I'll get 1 week on Pistoia.
Yeah.
So there is the reception of it's a interesting perception and reality here. So on one hand, the Jansenist position was definitely rigorous on receiving communion. You needed to go to confession, and if you needed confession, and display true contrition. So you needed to be sorry for having offended God because you love God, not because you're afraid of hell, which is attrition, or you're afraid of punishment of some kind. Okay. So that's a higher bar, if you will.
Yeah.
However, the image, and this goes back to the original, this goes back to Saint-Cyran and Antoine Arnaud and the women of Port Royal. The hope was that after someone had a real conversion, a conversion of life, like, someone like Pascal, that they would receive communion regularly. And regularly at the time in the 17th century, I think would not be more than once a month, I would think.
I'm actually surprised that that's a lot, actually. I was thinking.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it would normally be quarterly.
Okay.
But they were open in consultation with your confessor or your spiritual director. I think they were open to more like once a month. Again, this is the impression that I recall. I may be wrong about the specifics here. So in the documents of the Synod of Pistoia, they actually say lay people have a right to receive communion, and pastors who withhold that right are in sin. And they also have a right to receive during Mass and from particles consecrated during that Mass. Okay, so this is of a view with their whole Eucharistic theology, which we would completely agree with now, all of this stuff. So their ressourcement or their primitivism, we always say ressourcement when we mean something good, primitivism when we mean something bad. So they're looking back and they're seeing a patristic custom. And they're saying, well, they're, at least the Orthodox patristic tradition has to be right about that, right? So I do think there is a development that happens to where they go from saying there's widespread Eucharistic abuse and sacrilege going on in France. This is what their early Jansenists are saying, holy things for the holy. The Eucharist is, they would never say prize for the perfect, but it's the kind of mindset that, Pope Francis would denigrate in his opponents, right? They would say it's something for believers who have had conversions and are walking with the Lord very closely and, stuff like that. And they would say that it's because receiving unworthily is
to quote Paul, self-condemnation.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, but they get to the point where I think what they envision is, and maybe this is utopian or naive, but they envision good parish priests who are able to educate people on the truths that you must know for salvation, who are able to educate them on what the Eucharist is and on true contrition. And they do have a confidence. They have an extreme pessimism on some matters, but they do have a confidence in efficacious grace. And they do believe that if people are reading the Bible and the priesthood is reformed along the lines that they sketched, that there's going to be fruits and there's going to be a kind of revival. And you see this in France in the wake of Unigenitus, when you have these explosions of Jansenist, what we would call pietism, and even kind of charismatic, crazy stuff like the convulsionists. I mean, you do see groups of people having these profound religious conversion experiences. So I think that stamps the Jansenist mindset, and it becomes a bit less elitist by necessity, because the powers of church and state are arrayed against it, at least in France. So there is a kind of concept of the common simple believer could get to a point where they're living in grace and they're regularly receiving communion. So that's my read of a kind of development that happens. And
very
that is not that
Pope St. Pius X.
Yeah. Although I would say so.
Well,
the key difference is the key difference is that for Pius X would insist, of course, everyone should be confessing mortal sins. but there wouldn't be a before receiving communion. But there shouldn't be a bar for like you didn't have to have evidence of a conversion as such. You needed to be plugged into the sacraments constantly and don't commit a sacrilege by receiving when you have a mortal sin. But with the Jansenists, they did kind of have something we would associate more with like Protestants. They did kind of have a sense of like there's the laity who don't get it, and then there's the laity who do get it. So this would piss off Pope. This would piss off Pope Francis even more. This is like the anti-Pope Francis position. Because the fear is that this creates a church within a church.
I see.
So the true worshipers who adore God in spirit and truth are the people who get it.
Okay, yeah. I see. Yeah,
that's my read on it. They're never explicit about it because they know it's not going to go over well. Yeah. Although I guess they are explicit about other things that don't go over well. But anyway, I'm sorry I cut you off on Pius X. You were trying. You're correct to draw a connection.
Yeah, connection more of a, like when it comes to frequency and the age of the recipients. Yeah. But he, I mean, it's not exactly the same based on what you were saying about the other aspects of how they saw a reception of Holy Communion.
But it is in line with a concern that had not been fully worked out, and that people, anti-Jansenists, knew they had to work this out, and they did eventually work it out, even from someone as quote unquote conservative as Pius X.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, if there's anything else you want to bring up, Shaun, go right ahead. But go ahead.
I just wanted to close with just two things. So one is they have some really, really beautiful Christocentric stuff in here about Jesus, the spirit that groans within us. They're quoting St. Paul. They also are reliant on Pascal and a couple lesser well-known French Jansenists, François-Philippe Messanguy and Jacques-Joseph Duguay. So they have this very rich, what we would associate with the French school of spirituality, Pascal.
I mean, everyone loves Pascal, right? Yeah.
I mean, you can imagine how happy I was when Pope Francis
when that letter came out. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
It got leaked to me 5 minutes before by a friend in Rome.
I remember seeing that. Yeah.
So I was like a kid in a candy shop. I mean, it was literally like 5 minutes before, so I didn't have any insight.
And they also have Bossuet, his sermons. Oh my goodness, I used to read them. Funnily enough, when I was a kid in France, that would be some of the pious literature was Bossuet. Yeah,
amazing. So he's like. So you have these giants of French spirituality in the 17th century. Some are Jansenists or kind of pro-Jansenist. Many are not. Bossuet is not. I mean, Bossuet is very.
Oh, he's not a Jansenist?
No.
Oh, I thought he was. Oh, okay.
He was. I mean, no, he is not. Is the simple answer. He is sympathetic to some of their concerns, but he very strongly aligns with the Gallican but anti-Jansenist.
I see.
So, because I mean, Gallican is just like most French people, right? I mean, the perspective is like most of the doctors of the Sorbonne. It ebbs and flows, but anyway, Bossuet is a magnificent orator. And writer and thinker, and then François Fenelon was ultramontane, actually. So him and Bossuet clashed over pietism and also over ecclesiology, but they're both like spiritual giants, So that age feeds into the Synod of Pistoia as far as some of this really beautiful spiritual writing and Christocentric stuff is coming from this kind of golden age of French spirituality. And then the second thing I want to close with is that there is a pastoral response to the Synod of Pistoia by anti-Jansenists. So someone like Alphonsus Liguori, he's at the very end of his life. So I guess with Liguori, it's better to say Liguori is responding to Italian Jansenism. So the whole method of how he counsels confessors and spiritual directors to work with illiterate people is a kind of direct response to what he fears is an over intellectualization of the faith, a moral bar that most people can't pass, and a kind of denigration of their Marian devotion or their local saints. So Liguori holds the line on the doctrinal stuff of, Mary is a creature, God is the only infinite source of goodness, Jesus Christ is the sole mediator, And yet he's very, very, very open to displays of piety that that we would sometimes say, well, whoa, would sometimes take us aback. But that is a pastoral response to essentially to what we have going on in the Synod of Pistoia. So it's an alternative strategy, essentially.
Because I've read St. Alphonsus in school before, and I had no idea of this kind of context, of the profound context behind this writer. So anyway, that's just really helpful.
We talked about myths of Jansenism, and Therese of Lisieux is not in a Jansenist context. I mean, she's fighting scruples and rigorism. This is way, way, way later. But earlier figures like Liguori really are in a context of the Archbishop of Naples in the 1770s and 80s was a Philo-Jansenist. So you get parish priests who are saying, no absolution unless you display contrition. And some lay people were just saying, look, I'm in the confessional. I know this is wrong, but I just feel afraid of punishment. And the way that the Jesuit model is, use that as an opening for grace. Something has brought them into the confessional. They're here for a reason. Work with what you have. Whereas the Jansenists had an understanding of conversion that looks beautiful when it's Blaise Pascal, the night of fire, God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. But the sad reality is most human beings, it's just this constant struggle of mediocrity, because we're just mired in mediocrity. And I think the ultramontane perspective worked with mediocrity in a way that the Jansenists just couldn't, and that's one reason why they kind of lost this ecclesial battle. Yeah. So that's what I would close with. I could go on and on and on, as could you, and we could draw a million connections to Ratzinger.
I know.
he might his eyebrows might be raised a little bit if he knew that he comes up so much in a conversation on Jansenism.
Over Jansenists, excellent. All right, well, Dr. Shaun Blanchard, thank you so much for yet another excellent episode. Audience, if you enjoy this content, please hit the like button, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and feel free to leave a comment down below. If you want to support us, consider giving at patreon.com/thelogosproject. And without further ado, we'll see you guys next time. Shaun, thanks again.
Thanks so much.